We all ask big questions. Why is the world filled with trouble? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Some people have answers to these questions. For example, religion. Morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. Enemies and demons. Problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed and punished and defeated. Nationalism. Our tribe must claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Or reactionary thinking. In the past, our society lived in harmony and order until alien forces came and brought on degeneration and decadence. We must return the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe, but it's harder to identify what we do believe. In my book, Enlightenment Now, in Defensa de la Ilustración, I argue that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the Enlightenment, la Ilustración, namely that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Now, many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. As a result, they've faded into the background as a kind of status quo or the establishment. Other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I believe that Enlightenment ideals, too, need a positive defense and an explicit commitment, and that is what I've tried to do in the book. The Enlightenment, I suggest, has 4 themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each one. It all begins with reason, with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything except reason, as soon as you try to explain why you're right, why other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. Now, I am a cognitive psychologist, and I know that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. Humans are generalized from anecdotes. We reason from stereotypes. We all seek evidence that confirms our beliefs, and we dismiss evidence that disconfirms them. And we are all too confident about our own knowledge and wisdom and virtue. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms, such as free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which brings me to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, that we can understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment idea is that there can be a science of human nature, and that ideas about society are testable just like any other hypotheses about the world. The third value is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient creatures. Now, you might say, well, enhancing human flourishing, who could be against that? But there are alternatives to humanism. such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the faith, or the class, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure other people to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical dialectic or struggle or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. Now, by default, by itself, the circle of human sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain of our family, our close friends, our allies, cute little baby animals, and that's about it. But the circle of sympathy can be expanded through the forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, such as education, journalism, art, mobility, and even reason. As soon as I enter into a discussion with you, I can't insist that only my interests are special just because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Once you enter into discussion, there is a symmetry of interests and points of view. Finally, that leads to the ideal of progress. If we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well, because I have learned that intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, that means you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and a Pangloss, alluding to the Voltaire character who declared all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Well, as it turned out, Professor Pangloss was a pessimist. A true optimist believes there can be much better worlds than the one that we have today. But really, this is irrelevant because the question of progress is not a matter of having a sunny disposition or wearing rose-colored glasses or seeing the glass as half full. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, that is progress. Well, let's look at the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years of age. But then, starting in the 19th century with the adoption of vaccination and sanitation, and later antibiotics and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy has increased around the world now to 71 years. And almost no one guesses that it's that high. Now, as with most measures of progress, the development of progress has been very uneven. Europe and the Americas were the first regions to escape universal early death, but more recently, Asia has shown huge advances, and Africa is starting to close the gap as well. Now, for many of these measures, I've looked up what the situation is like in Argentina, and here you have the progress of life expectancy in Argentina since 1875. The average is a bit below Western Europe, but it is higher than South America, and of course much higher than the average for the world as a whole. It is about 76 years of age as of 2015. One of the reasons that life expectancy at birth historically was so low is that many children died before reaching the age of 5. For most of human history, about 1/3 of children died before their 5th birthday. But first, Sweden and other northern European countries brought their rate of child mortality down by a factor of 100, and then other parts of the world replicated this success. Countries in North America, like Canada, in Asia, like South Korea, and your neighbor Chile, and Ethiopia, even the countries in Africa, which have the most tragic levels of child mortality, have brought their levels way down. So even in Ethiopia, where the rate now is 7%, that is still way too high, but it is coming down, and we have to remember that even in Europe and the Americas, the rate used to be 30%. One of the biggest causes of premature death was infectious disease, and in recent years, even though infectious disease has largely been eliminated from wealthy countries, in poor countries, infectious disease has been coming down as well. In fact, the 5 biggest causes of childhood deaths, pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS, have all shown decreases just in the last 18 years. Sustenance. It takes about 2,500 calories to feed an adult male, and for the first time in the 18th century, some countries were able to grow that many calories because of advances in agronomy, like crop rotation, the invention of synthetic fertilizers, the mechanization of agriculture, the Green Revolution, which developed vigorous hybrid crops, and transportation networks that could bring food from farms to cities. The available calories, has increased first in European countries. More recently, China has been able to feed itself. India has had a huge increase in the amount of available food, and here is the graph for the world as a whole. Now, you might say this is a dubious form of progress if those calories are just making fat people still fatter. But in fact, they have been reducing the rate of undernourishment across the world. In 1970, about 35% of the people in the developing world suffered from undernourishment. But that rate has been cut down to less than half. Latin America was the first region in the developing world to drastically reduce undernourishment. Asia then followed, and even Africa, where undernourishment is still present, has shown a great deal of progress. The most severe effects of insufficient calories, of course, take place during famines. Famine was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and it could bring death and devastation to any region of the world. But thanks to the advances in agriculture, famine has now been banished just to the most war-torn and remote parts of the world. Prosperity. For most of human history, there was very little to zero economic growth. We can see that in this slide, which shows the gross world product from the year 1 to the year 2015. And as you can see, for more than 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel. But then, with the Industrial Revolution, advances in technology, the spread of education, institutions of markets and finance and global trade, the gross world product increased by a factor of almost 200 since the 1700s. Again, this development has been highly uneven. The UK and US were the first countries to escape universal poverty and destitution. But more recently, we've seen East Asian countries like South Korea shoot up. Latin American countries like Chile, China has shown great growth, and India as well. And there we have the curve for the world as a whole. Again, I promised you to show you the relevant data from Argentina. And here we have GDP growth in Argentina, which is don't have to tell you, a very complicated story with periods of rapid growth, but then punctuated by reversals. Nonetheless, the overall trajectory is upward, even though one often reads of Argentina, a century of decline. It isn't decline, it's growth that is lower than Western Europe, whereas Argentina used to be higher than Western Europe, but it is still growth. And of course, it far exceeds the rate of growth in the rest of Latin America. Again, the increase in gross world product or gross domestic product would not be an example of progress if it simply made the 1% richer. But in fact, the growth of prosperity has been decimating the rate of extreme poverty. 200 years ago, 90% of the world's population met today's definition of extreme poverty, but that has been reduced from 90% to less than 10%. In fact, there's been a 3/4 reduction in extreme poverty across the world just in the last 30 years. Development economists call this perhaps the greatest development in human history, and virtually no one knows about it. Now, because of the recent drop in extreme poverty, international inequality, after growing for 150 years, has started to decline. Now, it had to grow when there was a transition from all countries being poor to some countries escaping from poverty, which opened up a gap. But more recently, because poor countries have been getting richer faster than rich countries have been getting richer, international inequality is now declining. Now, within rich countries, of course, inequality has been increasing, not decreasing. But that doesn't mean that rich countries have been insensitive to the lives of the poor. Quite the opposite. For hundreds of years, the amount of a country's wealth that was redistributed to children, the poor, the sick, the elderly, was about 1%. But in the 20th century, every developed country embarked on a huge program of social spending, so that today the average OECD country devotes 22% of its GDP to social transfers. Thanks to this redistribution, the rate of poverty in most developed countries, even the United States, which has less social spending than Western European countries, but the rate of poverty, if you include government benefits, has decreased. In 1960, about 33%, 1/3 of Americans lived in poverty. That has fallen to about 7%. And if you take into account the drop in prices, the fact that clothing is so much more affordable, that food is so much more affordable, the poverty rate measured in terms of consumption has fallen to about 3%. Peace. For most of human history, the natural state of relations between empires and great powers was war. And peace was just a brief interlude between wars. You can see this in this graph, which shows the percentage of years that the great powers, the major states and empires, fought each other in wars, going back to 1500. And what the graph shows is that 400 or 500 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Now, they are virtually never at war. The last war between two great powers took place 65 years ago with the United States versus China in the Korean War. Now, if we zoom in on the 20th century, we see that even though wars became less frequent, two of the wars that took place were hugely destructive in a very short period of time, namely World War I and World War II. But contrary to predictions that I and many people grew up with, that World War III was going to just a matter of time, and that it would be even more destructive than World War I and World War II because of nuclear weapons, World War III never happened. The Soviet Union went out of existence, the Cold War ended, and in the years since 1945, there has been quite a dramatic decline in the rate of death from all wars combined, between all countries, including civil wars. There were big peaks for the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, and the Syrian Civil War. But even with the worst war in a generation, the Syrian Civil War, a horrendous war, the overall rate of death in warfare is much lower than it was in the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, and the 50s. Freedom and rights. We have all read about the backsliding away from democracy in countries like Venezuela, in Russia, in Turkey, in Poland. But still, the overall trend for the last 200 years has been very much in the direction of democracy, and the world has never been more democratic than it has been in this decade. 200 years ago, you could count the number of democracies on the fingers of one hand. Today, 2/3 of the world's countries and 2/3 of the world's population lives in countries that are more democratic than autocratic. Now, lest this seem impossible to believe, remember that in the 1970s, half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain, living under communist dictatorships. Most of Latin America, including for long periods of time, of course, Argentina, lived under military or right-wing dictatorships. In East Asia, Taiwan and South Korea and Philippines and Indonesia were all under control of military dictatorships. Today, they are all democratic. And of course, this is redundant to this audience. Argentina had 6 military coups in a period of 50 years. And then for the last 35 years, even with the financial crises, there has not been another military coup. Democracy, with all its flaws and complications, is stronger today than it was in the past. Violent crime. In most parts of the world where there is a state of anarchy, there are high rates of violence between people. For example, in medieval Europe, the rate of homicide was about 35 per 100,000 per year. As the medieval kingdoms established their control over their territories, the rate of homicide fell by a factor of about 35, from 35 per 100,000 to 1. That then happened a little later in Italy, and it's repeated whenever governments bring frontier regions of anarchy under the control of the rule of law. It happened in colonial New England, it happened in the American Wild West, and it even happened in a country that still has a high rate of homicide, namely Mexico. The rate of homicide used to be 10 times higher a century ago. If we zoom in just on the last 50 years or so, we see that the United States, which had a reversal of its crime rate in the 1960s, as did most Western countries, has managed to bring its rate of homicide down by about half. And the world as a whole has reduced its homicide rate by about 30% just in the last 2 decades. Again, I promised some data for Argentina. Here you see that the rate of homicide for Argentina is very close to that of the United States, in fact, close to the average for the world as a whole. It is much lower than the average for the rest of Latin America, not quite at the level of the world's safest countries like Sweden, but still pretty close to the world average. And if anything, there's maybe a little bit of a decline over the last couple of decades. In fact, we've gotten safer in just about every way. I'm going to show you now some data from the United States. Americans are 96% less likely to die in a car crash, 88% less likely to be killed on the sidewalk as a pedestrian, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to their deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to be burned to death, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated by gas. But there is one exception, and that is the category called poisoned by solid or liquid. And here you see the result of the opioid epidemic in the United States, of people taking overdoses of drugs like fentanyl and heroin and oxycodone. But in every other way, the rate of accidental death has been going down. Americans are 95% less likely to be killed on the job. They're even less likely to be killed by a so-called act of God. The droughts, floods, volcanoes, wildfires, landslides, storms, meteor strikes, earthquakes, there's been a 96% reduction. And even when it comes to the ultimate act of God, the literal bolt from the blue, the thunderbolt hurled by Zeus, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. For much of European history, only a small elite knew how to read and write, maybe about 15%. But European countries achieved universal literacy in the 20th century. And now the rest of the world is starting to catch up. There you have Chile, Mexico, and here the data for the world as a whole. Today, about 80% of the world can read and write, 90% of the world under the age of 25. Here's a graph that shows Argentina in comparison to other countries. There was a gap in literacy in the 19th century and early 20th century between Argentina and Western Europe, and now it is mostly closed. Now, I'm going to give you one example of human improvement that most people find almost impossible to believe. This is perhaps the most incredible example of progress that I have discovered, but it is well established, and that is, I know you're not going to believe this, we are getting smarter. In a well-documented phenomenon called the Flynn Effect, named after a philosopher James Flynn, who discovered it, IQ scores have been increasing all over the world by about 3 IQ points per decade, or for a century, resulting in a 30-point gain in IQ. This is a result partly of advances in public health, but largely through the expansion of education, and also by the spread of visual symbols and abstract technical concepts from science and technology into everyday life. Okay, all of those measures are the kinds of things that economists like to document. Have they actually made our lives better? The answer is, in many ways, they have. Take, for example, the amount of time we have to spend working. In 1870, the average work week in the United States and Europe was 62 hours. That has fallen to less than 40 hours, and most people also have paid vacation, which would have been inconceivable in the 19th century. Thanks to the universal penetration of running water, electricity, and the adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of time that in our lives that we lose to housework, which people say is their least favorite way of spending their time, has declined from 60 hours a week to 15 hours a week. That is 8 hours a day down to 2 hours a day. Because of the shortened work week and the reduction in the amount of time we spend on housework, the amount of leisure time that people have has increased more dramatically for men than for women. And the main reason is that women today spend more time with their children. In fact, today, a working woman spends more hours with her children than a stay-at-home mother did in the 1950s. Finally, does any of this make us any happier? And the answer is, mostly it does. In countries for which we have data going back 30 years, where people say how happy they are, 87% of the countries show a rise in happiness. And yes, that includes Argentina. Here are the data for Argentina from 1984 to 2014. Argentina, for all of the problems, is a relatively happy country on a scale. When people are asked across the world, if you imagine a ladder where the bottom rung is the worst possible life and the 10th rung is the best possible life, where are you? And Argentinians rate themselves at about 6.7 on the scale from 0 to 10. And that level of happiness has been, as I said, increasing over the last 30 years. Well, I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of just having an optimistic temperament or seeing the glass as half full. It is a real fact about the world. Now, how is this fact reflected in the news? Well, a data scientist did an algorithmic analysis of the ratio of positive words to negative words in a sample, a large sample of news stories since 1945, and has found that in all those years in which people's lives have gotten longer and healthier and safer and richer and happier, the news has gotten increasingly pessimistic. This is the New York Times. This is a sample of broadcasts across the world. So why do people deny progress? Part of the answer is comes from the nature of the way the human mind works, nature of human cognition. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, two famous cognitive psychologists, Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, showed that humans estimate risk and probability by a mental shortcut called availability, the availability heuristic. Namely, the more easily we can recall an example of something, the faster it comes into memory, the more frequent we think it is. Now, if you combine that with the nature of news, news is about things that happen, not about things that don't happen. You never see a journalist saying, I am reporting live from a country that is at peace, or a high school that has not been attacked by a shooter, or a city that has had no terrorists, or a country that has no famine. However, when anything goes wrong, of course, anywhere in the world, that is guaranteed to make the news. As a result, the human mind will think that things are getting worse as journalism expands its reach, even if things are getting better. If you ask people, what kills more people, asthma attacks or tornadoes? Most people say tornadoes, even though asthma attacks kill 40 times as many people as tornadoes. But tornadoes make for really good television. We remember the tornadoes. The people who die of asthma never make the news. Also, the news is about sudden events. And it's easier for something to go wrong very quickly than for something to go right very quickly. As Max Roser, an economist, has put it, the newspapers could have had the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline, and as a result, 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. Leading to a satire in the American humor magazine, The Onion, CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. There's also a feature of human psychology called the negativity bias, that bad is psychologically stronger than good. We dread losses more than we enjoy gains. We have a better memory for recent bad events than for recent good events, leading to the observation by the writer Franklin Pierce Adams, nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. There's also a kind of market forces for profits, that pessimists sound serious, they sound moral, they sound like they're trying to help us. Optimists often sound like kind of like salesmen. They sound frivolous or trivial. Let me end now with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that I'm sure have occurred to many people in this room. You might think, isn't it good to be pessimistic, to speak truth to power, to rake the muck. Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Of course, we have to be aware of dangers and crises and suffering and injustice wherever they occur, but we also have to be aware of how they can be reduced. Because even though there are dangers to being complacent, there are also dangers of being thoughtlessly pessimistic. One of them is fatalism. If you think that everything is just getting worse no matter what we do, well, why even bother? Why throw good money after bad? Why throw money down a rat hole? The poor will always be with you. The other danger is radicalism. If you think that all of our institutions are failing and that things are getting worse and worse, you'll be open to people who say that we should smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, to leaders who say only I can fix it, on the assumption that our current institutions are so disastrous that just destroying them all will result that anything that emerges from the ashes is bound to be better than what we have now. Next question, is progress inevitable? Does progress mean that everything becomes better for everyone, everywhere, all the time? Well, of course not. That would not be progress. That would be a miracle. And progress is not magic, it's not a miracle. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Now, problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems that have to be solved in their turn. Also, even though progress takes place, it's always possible that there are sudden, nasty surprises. In fact, I've mentioned some of them this evening. The 2 world wars, the increase in crime in the 1960s, the opioid epidemic in the United States. And of course, there are severe global challenges that we have not solved, including climate change and the threat of nuclear war. I think the way to approach these is to treat them as problems that are unsolved but solvable, that we have to deal with climate change by decarbonization, via putting a price on carbon, and developing low, zero, and eventually negative carbon energy sources. We should pursue denuclearization via a robust international community and reduction of nuclear arms, eventually culminating in zero. Final question, and this one speaks to me as a psychologist who has studied human nature, who believes that there is such a thing as human nature. Does the Enlightenment go against human nature? Is humanism just too tepid, arid, bland to get people's heart pumping? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. We've seen that secular liberal democracies are the happiest and healthiest places on earth, and they are the chief destination of people who vote with their feet. Also, I would argue that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic and glorious, maybe even spiritual. It's not just a myth. Myths are fictions, but this hero story is true to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have, and it is a hero story that applies not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity. Thank you. Gracias. Thank you.